I just want to say thank you to everyone.
And when it gets my job, you've got the best job in the world, which is just fantastic. Bye-bye.
Well, there he goes, off to who knows where. But let's not shed too many tears, because now it's time for Live and Kicking, the next generation.
The collapse of What's Up Dog, coinciding with Live and Kicking reaching its creative and ratings peak, saw the wheels coming right off the ITV Saturday AM bandwagon, until, as the turn of the century approached, they had all but smashed into a cliff face. New formats came and went so fast, the distinction between the main show and the summer replacement was all but lost. ITV spent most of the mid to late 90s flailing around in an increasing panic, while the BBC laughed its head off. In the history of the 90s Saturday morning, this was the long second act, the longest of all for the commercial broadcaster. Season 3 of What's Up Doc was so thoroughly buttoned down from its previous form that they might as well have hired Gordon Astley and had done with it. When it shuffled off in April 1995, the world beheld in its stead Scratchy & Co., made by Mentorn Productions for a returning Central.
Hey, Bob-a-ree Bob! That's so pretty! Hit it, bozo! Magnifico! Wow! That's better.
The main influence behind this one was fairly obviously Max Headroom, but without the wit or coherence. The late Mark Spade gave it all he'd got in the title role, weighed down physically by a gigantic plastic wig, and restricted by having to perform solely in single medium shots against a green screen. He was assisted by a variety of completely random cutaway characters, including his main sidekick, Reg, a kid in a plastic quiff with a man's voice, a penguin, a Tranmere supporting football, and Ronnie Ancona as Minnie the Minx, and some sort of Dorothy Gale takeoff. Scratchy & Co.'s alienating format didn't endear it to viewers, and it has a fairly toxic reputation 20 years on. But I was there on the front lines, and yeah, it wasn't very good. But it wasn't completely terrible. The horrendously tragic fate of Mark Spate tends to overshadow his achievement as a children's TV presenter, but he really was very good at it. Even in pretty thankless roles like Scratchy, a character created to be irritating and hyperactive, so in essence, if he wasn't annoying as hell in the role, he was doing it wrong. Let the record show he threw everything into it, as did Ancona and even the kid playing Reg, even if it didn't make it any less annoying to watch. Reg, incidentally, happens to be called Elliot Henderson Boyle and went on to some acting success as a smouldering teen, including an appearance as the young Lancelot in the long-forgotten Antoine Fuqua take on the Pendragon saga. Towards the end, Scratchy & Co. handed over for half an hour to Denise Van Outen and Malcolm Jeffries with Massive. This show within a show was ostensibly a music and lifestyle magazine aimed at an older audience than Scratchy's combination of gurning and cartoons. It sat rather uneasily as an embedded Petrushka doll of a programme, but was effectively a pilot for ITV's great and fantastic new idea, splitting the morning in two. Scratchy's main rival in Series 1 was the first series of Fully Booked, the one that was live, starred Zoe Ball and actually went out on Saturdays. Its more standard arrangement of shiny flawed interviews and phone-ins, both of which were rendered moot by Scratchy & Co.'s format, proved much more popular. Still, Scratchy did well enough to be recommissioned several times, presumably because it still had Animaniacs on it. It was also helped out by a complete inability on ITV's part to think of anything better. In fact, they were so completely stumped that Series 1 of Scratchy & Co. ran from April right through to the end of the year. January 1996 saw ITV implement their big innovation. Not one, but two Sat AM shows, one for the pre-teens and early tweens, and a youthier one for the over-12s crowd. First up was the self-consciously wackily titled Telegantic Megavision.
Lights.
Cameras!
Welcome to the Telegantic Megavision Studios. Your backstage tour is about to start.
We are going behind the scenes.
On air in 10 seconds.
Coming to cameras.
Hi, and welcome to the Telegantic Megavision Studios.
These are the studios where the magic is made.
Produced by Neil Buchanan's Media Merchants Company for TBS's successors Meridian, back home in the old faithful Maidstone studios. Buchanan appeared on screen occasionally, but the real hosts were Emma Lee and Dave Chapman, more usually to be found on CBBC, out of shot with his hand up Otis the Aardvark's arse. Like John Eccleston on Run the Risk, he was a bit less comfortable presenting without a puppet, but it didn't help that the show was so blandly forgettable. Based around a sort of TV studio behind-the-scenes type premise, it included the odd reasonably interesting tidbit on how TV shows are made, but up against Live and Kicking on the other side barely registered with anyone. The giveaway was the in association with involvement of Warner Brothers, still seeking a return on their investment in the TBS-originated What's Up Doc. Anyway, that was 1 hour of the morning. The second was given over to the cryptically titled It's Not Just Saturday, made by Scottish and hosted by Gareth Who Are We Kidding He'll Always Be Gaz Top Jones and Danny Minogue, attempting a broadcasting career after realising she didn't have her sister's musical talent. It's Not Just Saturday portrayed its intentions and main influence with the title sequence, bluntly ripped off from The Word, Channel 4's notoriously hedonistic and calculatedly arch youth with a capital F show. Of course, by 1996 The Word was already dead, having inevitably collapsed into a self-periodic black hole. As far as the 40-year-olds in charge of commissioning were concerned, it was still what the kids wanted to see. Ultimately, however, It's Not Just Saturday was relatively traditional Saturday AM fare, but geared to mid-teens and above, with a very deliberate dash of youth TV edginess, which was exactly what nobody wanted at 10:30 in the morning. Ratings barely registered. At one point, the whole thing failed to show up at all and was replaced with an episode of flailing underwater fantasy Sequest, for reasons never really made clear, largely because no one really cared either way. Before long, It's Not Just Saturday was cut down by half an hour, before ITV gave up on both it and Telegantic Megavision completely in April, and brought back Scratchy & Co. 3 months earlier than planned.
That's better.
Scratchy's world was retooled from Season 1. Though still pre-recorded, Spate was freed from the CSO, the locked-off medium shot and the rubber wig, and placed in a more traditional desk-bound studio setting. It was still almost killing itself to be wacky.
On your marks.
Get set.
Now we've got rid of Fat Pig, it's time to sprint in today's show with cartoons, craziness, and flying cucumbers.
Reg remained, wig intact, and Spate's newfound full-body freedom finally allowed him to flail his limbs as he had his face. But it was less nightmarish and random now that there was a tangible physical setting for the viewers to hold on to. The circus tent was tied down, and the better for it. Season 2 ran from May to August of 1996, whereupon ITV rolled the dice again on their brilliant 2-show idea. Possibly in spite of Telegantic Megavision, the media merchants were rehired for the pre-teen opening slot. And they came back with WOW.
Oh, the name?
Which stood for Watch Out Weekend, in as much as it stood for anything, which in all honesty it didn't. Your presenters were Simeon Corty, previously a foil for Otis the Aardvark on CBBC, and the legendary Sophie Aldred. WoW was actually pretty good, by all accounts, partly because it didn't have a concept, premise or template, and was instead just a regular Saturday morning show with guests and competitions and jokes and the odd pie fight. The glory days of What's Up Doc were briefly reprised, not only in the Maidstone setting, but by the return of Stephen Taylor Woodrow and Pete Cox, as a pair of tea ladies, hovering about behind the hosts, trying to make them corpse. There was even a link to Get Fresh, in the shape of Sid, a puppet who claimed to be a blue bottle and was voiced by Phil Cornwell, in somewhat more subdued a fashion than Gilbert the Alien had been.
Treble three, isn't it, Sydney? That's right. Yeah. Your East End friends. Louise will be here with her new single after the break. She's a lovely Hoover. See you later.
WoW didn't quite fly as close to the sun with the innuendos and subversion as What's Up Doc had. Besides, they didn't have to keep a giant American conglomerate happy. So as time went on, the show actually became looser, funnier, and messier in a good way. By the height of autumn, Sophie and Simeon were starting to attract the occasional sincere and favourable comparison to Tiswas. Unfortunately, WoW did have a few things going against it. The first was the debut of the all-conquering Jamie and Zoe on the other side. Although with a bit more faith and a longer run, WoW could potentially have emerged as a viable rival, who knows. Another problem was the two-show format, which meant WoW ended after an hour just as it was building up steam, to make way for the noise. Boggest standard music magazine imaginable, presented by that man Andy Peters. This was supposed to complement WoW by satisfying the 12 and up demographic, but as it was just a watered down ozone blown up to an hour, it really only served to hold WoW back. And not just creatively, it turned out to be ratings poison. The final knife in WoW's back was good old eternal ITV politics. The commercial broadcaster had recently taken the Formula 1 coverage rights from the BBC, by the simple method of outbidding the corporation tenfold. Suddenly there was a £60 million gap in ITV's wallet, and in true George Osborne fashion, to pay for this extravagance, something would have to be cut to the bone. First in the queue for the chopping block in a situation like this? Religious programme. But second is children's TV. Now, Scratchy & Co. was entirely pre-recorded and canned and filmed solely on one relatively small set in a corner of Central Studios, which, and this is the real kicker, they were letting Mentorn use free of charge, because SatAM was such a plum slot. Put together, it meant Scratchy's antics ultimately only cost the network a few grand for the whole series. WoW, on the other hand, went out live every week, and made extensive use of the Maidstone studios, which the media merchants were decidedly not getting for free. And then alongside it, the noise was costing 80 grand a week and no bugger was watching it. Even George Osborne could do the maths. And this was all very clear from very early on. Even as word of mouth spread, WoW's ratings rose and a potential audience started to build up, WoW was basically doomed. After Christmas, both it and the noise were hurled into a bin in favour of more Scratchy & Co., this time 5 months earlier than anyone, including Mentorn, were expecting. By now, this programme was the closest thing to a solid SatAM show ITV had, and it was increasingly the only watched at all for Batman and the rest of the WB animated stable. The traditional winter-summer schedule had been completely beaten out of shape by sheer desperation, with WoW and the Noise only lasting half a season each, before Scratchy showed up in January 97 to finish off the winter-spring shift. Once he was done, it was time to fill the space that once would have been considered the summer replacement, if there was anything solid to replace anymore, and ITV weren't just hurling new formats at the wall like an automated tennis server having a breakdown. Summer 1997 was covered by the nearly entirely forgotten and vanishingly rare in the archives, MASH'd. This came from Tyne Tees, although by then they were basically the junior franchise of Yorkshire. And like WOW, represented a welcome return to live Saturday morning broadcasting, albeit apparently on a budget of about a tenner, to judge by the studio set, which at times looked suspiciously like they got it second-hand from TVAM's Top Banana. Your hosts this time were Jeremy Edwards, then young enough to go under Jez without looking like a twat, and an eerie puppet ape with a Brummie accent, voiced and operated by Simon Buckley, the erstwhile Nobby the Sheep. He was called Jarvis, and he drank bottles of what he called Brit Pop. Unfortunately for all concerned, it was 1997. Not that anyone was watching either way, despite the BBC having moved their competitor to Sundays and MASH's direct competition being the 90s Hulk cartoon and repeats of Grange Hill from 1989 linked by a puppet aardvark. At this point, Live and Kicking was so huge and ITV so completely and totally lost in the wilderness, it didn't really occur to anyone to watch the commercial broadcast of a Saturday morning. Their next attempt in the autumn of 1997 didn't do much to change that. This one was the responsibility of Granada for what that was worth, but the real producers were Real-Time Animation, and the clue to the gimmick was in their name.
And now, finally, here is your host, Ricky!
Well, hey! Hello, Dragon fans! Yes, I'm Tricky. Who's let the dogs in? What's happening? This is Purdy, and you're watching a barking mad edition of Tricky! Well, hey! Not only do we interview Gary...
Tricky was the name of the show and its host, a lime green Mancunian cartoon dragon, animated live and in real time. I say animated, the technology as it existed in 1997 couldn't really do much more than make his mouth roughly correspond with what was being said, and occasionally throw a jerky lean forward or throw the arms. Never has the latest in animated technology looked so unimpressive. Tricky was obviously conceived and pitched by the animators before they really knew what the technology was capable of. Even when The Simpsons did the same thing a couple of years ago, Homer was noticeably placid and given to reacting with what was clearly one of several generic animation routines. And that was nearly 20 years later. Before long, a young Claudia Winkleman was parachuted in as a Chegwinian on-location human host, so the kids would have something interesting to look at, but to no avail. If the essentially solid MASH couldn't make it against Saturday Aardvark, the actively poor Tricky had no chance in hell against Jamie and Zoe.
Wow, weren't the Animaniacs brilliant? Because they were caught in disaster there, weren't they? Get it caught in because they were lawyers this week and they were in a courtroom and stuff. Anyway,
Tricky was inevitably kicked into the long grass after Christmas and replaced in January once again by what turned out to be the last series of Scratchy & Co. Although because Tricky was more expensive to animate than he looked, he did get a very, very, very minor reprieve indeed, linking cartoons and music videos as the face of very, very small digital kids channel Pop in the early aughties. He'd acquired a Scottish accent and was calling himself Rory, but it was the same animation routines as ever.
My feet haven't stopped tapping, and if you want more, don't move an inch. More funky music after the break.
The BBC watched their competitors and laughed and laughed. They barely even had competition anymore. Live and Kicking was the biggest children's show on television, one of the biggest shows full stop. It even won a BAFTA at one point. And it didn't seem like ITV were even trying. It may have taken half the sport away from them at extortionate prices, but ownership of Saturday mornings was a much sounder investment anyway, they told themselves. And there was no danger whatsoever of that slipping away from them. Everything is subject to entropy, however. Even Imperial Phase Live and Kicking. And over the course of the 90s, bits gradually started dropping off the show. Trev and Simon only lasted one Zoe and Jamie season, largely restricted to a cordoned off and mostly pre-recorded sketch show called Transmission Impossible, partly to keep them out of trouble and partly so it could be repeated in its own right on CBBC later in the week. Their initial replacements were one half of the comedy collective The Cheese Shop, who...
So, fellas, what are you doing?
Hey, well, you haven't introduced us yet, Jamie.
Yeah, okay.
We're not even on the train.
Okay, go on then. You're
yeah, Rich,
Ben, Rosemary, Jazz, Valerie. Okay, and what do you do?
Yeah.
We're new. Yes, new boys. New boys.
We're okay. Meanwhile, John Eccleston had to take a year off to do Farscape, necessitating the sudden appearance of a third leprechaun. Run the Risk was quietly dropped halfway through Jamie and Zoe's first season, and in a rare case of an entropic addition, Mr. Blobby joined the team, completing his journey from over-the-top piss-take of obnoxious and meaningless children's TV characters to becoming literally that thing. But even without Trevor and Simon, Live and Kicking was the best thing on Saturday mornings, and not even by default. Despite the competition, the show was strong enough to stand up against a good alternative had there been one. More than that, its name had become, like Top of the Pops, an unstoppable brand in itself that transcended its origins in a way no Sat.AM show had managed before. It had its own magazine, a Friday spin-off, even a video game of sorts where you edited an episode together. Even your grandmother had heard of Live and Kicking, even if she didn't know what it actually was. With ITV flailing incoherently in a panic, they were practically omnipotent, which is of course the perfect breeding ground for complacency. Even as various pieces detached themselves and floated away, even when the biggest piece floated off into the distance. By now, Zoe Moore was doing the Radio 1 breakfast show, taking the opposite route to Noel Edmonds and Mike Reed, and the workload was starting to weigh heavy on her shoulders. Theakston too was starting to get itchy feet, and so he and Zoe both decided to leave simultaneously, as had become semi-traditional. Where Andy, and as it turned out Emma's departure in 1996 had only been of minor interest to most of the media at large, even though Andy himself in his last episode acted like a condemned man being led to the gallows.
Thank you to everyone. I can't do it.
The following 3 years, Life and Kicking had become sufficiently massive that this was now colossal entertainment news. Apart from anything else, the two most desirable jobs in British broadcasting just became vacant. After the announcement was made in early 1999, you couldn't move in the papers or magazines for speculation as to who was going to take over. And in a certain kind of magazine, acres of skin from young female presenters coincidentally trying to raise their profile, followed by disapproving think pieces in The Guardian which mostly scolded the women for taking their clothes off rather than the media who'd made such an activity into a career move in the first place. But in the end, the BBC went with two relative unknowns. Steve Wilson had some CBBC experience under his belt and was already Live and Kicking adjacent through presenting the Friday spin-off. Alongside him was the lovely Emma Ledden, a 23-year-old former model known in her homeland as a presenter of The Den, effectively children's RTE. It was something of a risk. Steve was only vaguely familiar to kids from CBBC, whereas Emma was a complete unknown in this country. But the BBC thought it was easily worth taking. This was Live and Kicking after all. Even if they turned out to be a pair of illiterate farmhands, the show was strong enough to survive, as long as they were careful. After all, what competition did it have? Well, by the time Zoe and Jamie left, the answer was a concoction with an unpromising title, an artless approximation of text speak, and an even more unpromising title sequence, despite being made by Jamie Hewlett. The presenting team didn't inspire confidence either, consisting of a completely unknown Brummy model named Kat Deely, and Biker Grove tadpoles turned pop stars Ant and Dec. Sure enough, for the first few months, SMTV Live was a mess of wooden presenters delivering unfunny scripts in front of under-rehearsed crew members. To make matters worse, ITV axed the legendary chart show to make way for an undercooked Top of the Pops called CD UK as its sister programme, which made a lot of people resent it on general principles. The BBC sat back and sighed. ITV still didn't know what they were doing. Even with Zoe and Jamie leaving, they were perfectly safe. This wasn't going to go anywhere.